If you walked into your own restaurant and no one recognized you, then discovered someone was secretly poisoning the very legacy your family built, what would you do? If anyone ever asked what scent most vividly reminded him of his youthful dreams, Julian Baker would not hesitate to say it was the smell of pizza baking in a stone oven. That warm, savory aroma, rich with tomato sauce and bubbling cheese, was once the very reason he left his job as a mechanical engineer to start over with nothing but 2 hands and a dream, transforming a small corner shop into the now renowned Baker's Hearth restaurant chain. But today, as he stood quietly across the street looking toward store number 1, the place where it all began, that familiar scent only made his stomach twist in knots. Not because of the food, but because of the heavy knot of unease weighing deep in his chest. Something was deeply wrong inside the very place he built from scratch. The worn-out baseball cap he borrowed from his teenage son made him look like a middle-aged man clinging to youth. The oversized hoodie and faded jeans were far from the style of the man once praised by culinary magazines as the king of artisan pizza. But that was the point. Ever since receiving an anonymous note with just one chilling line, "You no longer own this place," Julian had made up his mind. He would return, disguised as a stranger, to see the truth with his own eyes. And if someone was secretly destroying everything he had worked so hard to create, that person was about to have the worst day of their life. Crossing the street, Julian kept his head low, gripping the brim of his cap to avoid being recognized. The door chime rang out a familiar tone, but it no longer carried the warmth it once had. Something was off inside the restaurant, not a sign of progress, but a quiet neglect in the employees' expressions, the cook's unhurried movements, even the background music blaring too loudly for mid-morning hours. Julian approached the counter like any other customer. No one recognized him. But what disturbed him more than anonymity was the indifference hanging in the air. "Welcome to Baker's," mumbled the young cashier, Noel reciting the greeting like a bored script, eyes glued to his phone. Julian raised his voice slightly, adding a hint of fake nervousness. "1 slice of pepperoni and a soda, please." Noel glanced up for barely a second, offered no smile, and didn't ask for confirmation. $7.50. But what caught Julian's attention wasn't just the cold attitude, it was the fact that Noel didn't enter the order into the POS system. Instead, he scribbled something on a sticky note and yelled toward the kitchen, "1 pepperoni!" The receipt Julian was handed wasn't thermal paper either, but a flimsy sheet that looked like it could tear any second. Julian took his meal and sat at the table closest to the counter, eating while quietly observing. The pizza slice was cooler than usual, the cheese pale and stiff, lacking the signature stretch and richness he once taught his staff to achieve by precisely managing oven temperature. A group of construction workers entered, familiar faces, but rather than their usual excitement, they placed their orders quietly. One leaned toward another and whispered, "Quality's gone down, doesn't taste like it used to." Julian tightened his grip around the crust, a swell of frustration and sorrow rising in his chest. The thing he feared most might be coming true. What he had passed on was being slowly watered down, not by market forces, but by the very people inside. And if that was the case, he knew he would have to do more than sit and watch. This was no longer about protecting a pizzeria. This was about saving the soul of an entire legacy. Julian sat motionless, pretending to nibble on a slice of cold pizza like a disappointed customer, but every sense in his body was alert, tracking the smallest movements inside the restaurant. Across the counter, Jade, a red-haired cashier, had just finished taking an order from the group of workers, and she too didn't touch the POS system. She was using a notebook, different from Noel's but just as cheap, with ink of a different color. The coincidence set off alarms in Julian's mind. It could be laziness, it could be carelessness, but his instincts told him the opposite. This was an off-the-books system, a shadow operation, and that meant the money might be going somewhere else. One of the workers, the oldest among them, held up his slice of pizza, inspecting it closely, then let out a heavy sigh. "My granddaughter used to beg for this place every weekend. Now she'd rather have Domino's." Julian closed his eyes for a brief moment. Comments like that, when read online, could be dismissed as exaggerations. But hearing it firsthand in the heavy air of the very restaurant he once held as a gold standard felt like a needle to the heart. The current head chef, a young man named Emile, emerged from the back carrying 2 trays of pizza, both with uneven toppings and one side of the crust slightly burnt. Julian recognized the mistake immediately. This was not how a baker's hearth kitchen operated. He had once strictly banned using dough that hadn't been proofed long enough, often saying, "Every slice is a statement of self-respect." Then everything changed when a woman stormed in, her face flushed with anger. She held a pizza box in one hand and carried a child of about 4 in the other. "This is the 3rd time this week you've sent the wrong order. I asked for cheese pizza for my son's birthday and you delivered spicy jalapeno." Her voice trembled with fury. Jade stepped forward, calm as if rehearsed. "We sincerely apologize. There's been an issue with our ordering system. Would you like a refund?" The woman clenched her teeth. "I want to speak to the manager." Noel immediately cut in. "Mr. Baker is away on a business trip. He's dealing with personal matters." Julian froze. He hadn't gone anywhere. For the past 3 weeks, he had been upstairs in the office, combing through the books, wringing his hands over numbers that didn't add up. And then, like the final knife twisting into his trust, Julian heard Jade whisper to Noel behind the counter, "This game's easier than I thought. He still thinks it's just customer complaints." Noel let out a quiet laugh, soft but chilling. Julian pulled out his phone, opened the voice recorder app, and hit record. His hand trembled slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the lifeless slice of pizza in front of him. Something far darker was unfolding here. This wasn't just operational failure. It wasn't a case of a few lazy employees. This was a deliberate underground operation, so precisely coordinated that even the lies were rehearsed. If someone was orchestrating this from the shadows, they were playing a high-stakes game, and they believed Julian didn't know the rules. Julian placed his phone face down on the table, the microphone still recording steadily with each second, while his mind spiraled into the venomous whispers he had just overheard. Jade and Noel weren't merely skimming money. They were deliberately sabotaging the restaurant to craft a story of failure. But why? Out of greed, resentment, or was it something more intricate? While he sat silently observing, the two continued their conversation. Jade's voice dripped with mockery. "Did you see his face when he checked the books last week? He looked like he was about to cry." Noel replied with a sneer, "Still making the sauce by his grandpa's recipe, measuring every gram. Meanwhile, all I need is..." He tapped his coat pocket, and Julian immediately recognized the shape. A small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. "Flavor modifier?" Jade lowered her voice. Noel nodded smugly. "Just a few drops and the whole thing tastes like a discount science project. Smells the same, but tastes like cardboard. Dylan says it works perfectly, non-toxic, but dead inside." That name sent a chill straight through Julian's spine. Dylan Moritz, a former night shift supervisor, bright, business degree holder, full of energy, and the very person Julian had fired 8 months ago after catching him skimming money from the till after hours. At the time, Julian hadn't reported it. He chose the merciful path, believing Dylan was young, still had a future. But that night, Dylan had shouted in the empty dining room, "Who do you think you are, stealing my future? I'll make you regret this." Julian had dismissed it then as the outburst of a desperate man. Now it wasn't just a threat. Jade continued. "Dylan said that old man refuses to sell, too attached to his family legacy. So show him how quickly a legacy can rot." Noel nodded. "I've already started phase 2. My buddy at the health department has pictures from back when Dylan still worked here. Says there's going to be a major violation filed next week." Their tone sounded like casual coffee shop chatter, but their content was straight from the blueprint of a high-level sabotage. Julian felt his stomach twist. All his life he had obsessed over cleanliness, over every glove, every oil stain on the stovetop, and now someone was trying to stain his reputation using filth he never allowed. But why? For money, revenge, or to take over the very place he built from flour, cheese, and stubborn patience? The bell above the door rang again. Julian didn't need to turn to recognize the footsteps. Light, yet deliberate, each step as precise as the slice of a chef's knife. Clarissa Ewan, head chef of 11 years, entered the room. Dressed in jeans and a casual jacket, she wasn't on the schedule today. "Is Mr. Baker here?" she asked loudly. Noel looked up. "Probably hiding upstairs like always." Clarissa's grip tightened on her bag. Her eyes passed over Noel, then paused on the bulge in his pocket, a flicker of tension flashing across her face. I need to review the ingredient stock sheets, she said, stepping toward the kitchen door. But Jade responded too quickly. We're waiting on a health inspection. Best not to let anyone off shift inside. Clarissa froze, her hand still on the doorknob. Her gaze shifted from alert to composed. All right, she said, stepping back. I'll come back later. But as she turned, Julian caught a glimpse beneath her coat. A small black device, unmistakable. A mini camera. She didn't say another word, didn't look back. But from behind the glass, Julian knew she hadn't come by chance. She knew something. She had her suspicions, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight. Julian left the restaurant as quietly as he had entered. No one noticed. No one suspected that the man eating a lukewarm slice of pizza had once been hailed as the Pope of artisan baking in the region. But inside him, the silence had been replaced by a storm. What he had witnessed was no longer an internal rebellion, it was an orchestrated campaign. And when Dylan's name surfaced in that conversation, all the puzzle pieces began to align. Across the street, Julian climbed into his car, barely closing the door when a calm voice rang out. Baseball caps on backwards. Doesn't suit a guy who hates baseball. He turned, startled, to find Clarissa standing beside an old delivery van, arms folded, face devoid of humor but also free of anger. Knew it was you the moment you crossed the street, she said. That slight limp from your high school baseball injury? Nobody else walks like that. Julian half smiled, half sighed, though suspicion still flickered in his eyes. Clarissa didn't wait for questions. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through a series of photos. Altered receipts, snapshots of Noel adding chemicals to the sauce pot, falsified delivery forms with forged signatures, and then something even more damning, a message thread between Dylan and someone named Gerald Clune. Gerald wasn't a stranger. He was the regional director of Eastbrook Capital, a real estate conglomerate pushing to acquire the entire historic district, with Baker's Hearth as the last stubborn holdout. Clarissa pointed to a zoning proposal bearing the company logo. They want to turn this whole block into a shopping center, and you're the last obstacle. Dylan? He's just the tool. Julian clenched the steering wheel. He remembered 6 months ago, a real estate firm approached him, promising a smooth retirement deal. He declined. 3 weeks later, sales began to plummet. Now it all made sense. This wasn't coincidence. There's more, Clarissa said, pulling out a thick folder. Inside were asset evaluations, drafted construction permits, falsified environmental reports, all prepared before Dylan was even fired. They planned every move, she added. But what they didn't plan on was that I have a brother in corporate law, and he's seen this playbook before. Same company, same tactics. Julian leaned back in his seat, eyes drifting into the distance. What he had tried to protect was no longer just a pizza shop. It was a symbol of 3 generations' memories. The place where his father taught him how to knead dough, where he passed down a handwritten recipe to his son, the place the community simply called home. Clarissa watched him, her voice carrying a trace of hesitation for the first time that day. They've saved one final move. A fabricated money laundering report is set to reach the Treasury next week. Totally fake. Their goal is to erase you, from the map and from your own name. But Julian didn't react as she expected. He didn't flare up, didn't panic. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't belong to someone defeated, but to someone who had just seen his path to victory. If Dylan thinks he's playing chess, he said, he should know some of us were born playing Go. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. On the other end, a male voice answered, Economic Crimes Division. How may I help you? Julian's response was calm, measured, as if placing a pizza order. I've got a case worth reopening your RICO files, along with evidence, witnesses, and a story you won't want to miss. Clarissa tilted her head. RICO? Julian nodded. Racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. They used it for the mafia. Today, we use it for men in suits. 3 days after that fateful meeting, the upstairs office at Baker's Hearth was unrecognizable. Once a quiet corner where Julian sipped coffee, flipped through the paper, and balanced the books, it had now transformed into a covert command center. The walls were covered with diagrams linking Dylan, Noel, Jade, and Gerald Clune, the white-gloved executive from Eastbrook Capital. At the center stood Julian, a man presumed to have been swept away by the undertow but who was in fact preparing a calculated counterattack. What did your contact at the FBI say? Clarissa asked as she closed the door behind her. Julian looked up from his desk, gently spinning a sleek new pen between his fingers. It looked like any other office tool, but in truth it was a high-tech recording device. "They're excited," he said. "Turns out Eastbrook has been involved in 3 similar cases across 3 different states, but they never had enough evidence to prosecute." He set the pen down and gave a faint smile. "And now we're handing them the entire stage, the full script and all the actors." Clarissa handed him a small box. "Here's the micro camera, hidden in a coat button. Resolution's high enough for court presentation." A knock at the door startled them both slightly. It was Noel, holding a stack of delivery invoices. Julian shifted seamlessly back into character, lifting the pen recorder and signing with deliberately slow strokes. "Anything I should be aware of?" he asked, his voice casual, though his eyes watched every flicker of Noel's body language. The young man flinched slightly, brushing a hand against the pocket Julian already knew held the flavor-altering chemical. "No, nothing at all," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. As Noel exited, Clarissa murmured, "He's starting to suspect." Julian nodded. "Then it's time to cast the bait." That afternoon, Clarissa placed a carefully crafted phone call. "Hello, Dylan. This is Clarissa, head chef at Baker's. I overheard some things you said at the bar last week, about the old man, about the plan." Her voice trembled just enough. "I've got something you might want to see, but we need to talk in person. Bar, 3 towns over, tonight." The line had been cast, and the fish, driven by greed and desperation, was certain to bite. At the same time, Julian stepped into a high-rise clad in polished glass. The logo of Eastbrook Capital shimmered against dark stone. "Mr. Clune will see you now," the receptionist said, wearing the cold professionalism of someone well-practiced at towing moral lines. Inside the 15th floor conference room, Clune greeted him with a smile rehearsed too many times in front of a mirror. "Quite the surprise, Mr. Baker. I thought you'd let go." Julian sat down, his gaze calm, as though the meeting was about flower prices. "I'm not here to sell," he said. "I'm here to give you something." He placed a USB drive on the table, nodding slightly. "It contains evidence showing you paid a former employee of mine, someone I fired for embezzlement, to sabotage my business and manufacture a reason for a forced buyout." Clune's expression remained composed. He was a seasoned player, but Julian had faced sharper players and lived to tell about it. As he lightly tapped a finger on the table, Clune's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his face drained of color. A flood of messages appeared, from Dylan, from the PR department, from investors, accompanied by screenshots of accusations, documented evidence, even videos. Dylan, just as predicted, had released everything in a fit of betrayal. Julian rose from his chair with the unhurried grace of a man who had just savored a perfect meal. "People often underestimate loyalty," he said, "which is exactly why they never see its power coming." And just before leaving the room, he added in a voice light as a late autumn breeze, "Baker's Hearth is not for sale, not today, not ever." That afternoon, Baker's Hearth was unusually crowded. Outside the doors, dozens of people had lined up, regulars, curious foodies, even a few local news crews. Though Julian had sent out no invitations, the rumor spread faster than kitchen smoke. Word was, the longtime owner of the district's oldest pizzeria would appear, bake pizzas with his own hands, and reveal something unprecedented. Inside, Julian stood behind the open kitchen counter, wearing the same apron he had worn when he first opened the store. In front of him, the dough station was set, and behind him, the stone oven glowed red, the very oven that had shaped generations of skilled bakers. 2 faces in the room had gone pale with fear, Noel and Jade. Just an hour ago, they had been called into the upstairs office, and now they sat frozen as every customer watched the chef, and the very owner they once thought had disappeared. "Sit down," Julian said, not loudly, but with a tone that silenced the entire room. "I think the 2 of you should hear this along with everyone else." At that moment, the back door burst open. Dylan, the man who once acted as Eastbrook's mole, stormed in, clutching a stack of documents, his face still flushed from that morning's media backlash. "You played me," he shouted. "You think you're so smart for making me expose everything myself? I'll open my own place, use your recipe, and crush you on this very block." The room fell silent. Julian didn't even lift his eyes from the dough in his hands. He simply smiled. "The recipe?" Clarissa stepped out from the office, holding a deep red leather-bound notebook, the master book, which only one person had ever been allowed to touch. "You took the handwritten English version from the drawer, didn't you?" Julian asked, eyes still on Dylan. I left it there the day I fired you, Dylan snarled. Yeah, and I copied all of it. You think I can't make sauce? I have a business degree. Only then did Julian lift his head, his voice as calm as a lecture. That's a shame, because the real recipe is written in ancient Greek, the language my grandfather used while fleeing Athens in 1948. What you took was a decoy, one I wrote after noticing you sneaking into my office. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Dylan froze. Clarissa laid the book open on the counter, revealing intricate, looping handwriting that spoke for itself. The original isn't just a set of instructions, it's heritage. You can copy the words, but you can't steal history. Julian stepped out from the kitchen, his gaze sweeping across the room filled with misty-eyed regulars. The elderly woman who had lost her husband in the war, but still came every year on his memorial, the retired doctor who held his golden anniversary there, and even the young folks who had never known another pizza place. Today, he said, every meal is free. But I'll be the one baking, with the real recipe, from the real heart. Dylan collapsed into a chair as if all the rage had drained him completely. Clarissa quietly pulled out her phone. FBI agents were waiting for the final confirmation to proceed with the formal arrest. Noel and Jade, who had now confessed everything, began drafting their full written statements. All the evidence was being delivered to the press, investigators, and Eastbrook's board of directors. The next morning, as the sun touched the rooftops of the old district, a line had already wrapped around the baker's hearth block. News of the historic standoff between a pizza shop owner and a notorious real estate conglomerate spread like wildfire. But this time, no one came for the scandal. They came for hope, the kind being baked to a golden crisp in the stone oven tucked into the kitchen corner. Julian stepped out, not in a suit, not wearing an apron, but clutching the recipe book to his chest, as if he were carrying the heartbeat of an entire generation. Inside the kitchen, everything gleamed as if reborn. Brand new equipment paid for with the first compensation from the lawsuit against Eastbrook, and a newly assembled team, former chefs and bakers once unemployed after their restaurants were bought out by fast food chains. Clarissa stood among them, eyes sharp like a general preparing for a major campaign. Starting today, she said, we're not just serving food, we're serving a statement. That local flavor will not bow to industrial taste. Julian gathered the entire staff in the main dining room, holding a stack of documents in hand. He raised one high. This isn't an employment contract, it's a pledge to protect the community. Clarissa followed, handing out copies. We call it the Hearthfire Initiative, a legal and support fund for family-owned eateries under threat from corporate giants. 10% of profits from Baker's Hearth will go directly to helping them fight back. Applause broke out, not for the inspirational story, but because every person there knew it was real. Every number, every name, every intent. At lunch, as Julian carefully sprinkled shredded cheese onto a large pizza for a reserved table, the door opened. Mrs. Esperanza, the longtime customer who had vanished during the restaurant's darkest days, walked in with her husband. Her eyes shimmered with tears as she reached out with an old letter. We wrote to you when we thought this place had changed hands. I never imagined you were still here. Julian took the letter gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Your table never left. By afternoon, Clarissa wheeled in a large screen. On it was a live video conference with dozens of small restaurant owners from across the United States. People who had been pressured by Eastbrook and similar corporations to sell, who had suffered fake violations or had their reputations sabotaged online. Julian looked around the room. What happened to us is not unique, and we have proof. A middle-aged woman from Chicago turned on her camera, her voice shaking. They took everything, my sign, my recipes, my customers. I thought I had nothing left to fight with. Julian quietly opened the recipe book, held it up. We don't fight alone. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When the call ended, a new network had formed, dozens of local restaurants now sharing legal resources, pro bono attorneys, internal audit tools, and strategies to combat smear campaigns. In the office, Clarissa received word. Dylan had officially pleaded guilty. He was granted a reduced sentence for cooperating but still required to pay restitution. As for Jade and Noel, after giving full statements, they were now completing community service and taking classes on professional ethics. 1 month after the fateful confrontation, Baker's Hearth didn't just return, it was reborn. The glass storefront, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the soft light of morning, while a line of customers stretched all the way down the block, not to chase discounts but to rediscover something they thought was lost: the taste of integrity. On the front page of the morning paper was a bold headline: "Pizza Shop Exposes Nationwide Takeover Scheme, a Historic Turnaround, Sparked by a Handwritten Recipe." Below it, a photo of Julian Baker standing beside an open oven, one hand holding the deep red recipe book aloft, the other kneading dough beside his son. A living symbol of legacy. Inside the restaurant, everything breathed a renewed sense of purpose. The young staff, dressed neatly in uniform, bustled with cheerful energy, not out of fear of being watched, but because they knew they were part of something greater than just a job. In the back office, Clarissa had just received word from her brother, a corporate lawyer. The RICO lawsuit against Eastbrook had officially been accepted by the federal court. "We didn't just save a pizza shop," she said, her eyes gleaming. "We're rewriting the rules of the entire industry." Julian nodded, though his eyes lingered on the window, where golden morning rays painted streaks of light across the worn tile floor. He thought of his father, who taught him to feel the proof of dough with a touch, and of his grandfather, who once said, "Good pizza must have a soul. Never let someone hollow out your food for profit." For a moment, Julian had nearly allowed that to happen, until everything nearly collapsed. But now, looking back, he didn't feel defeated. On the contrary, it was that moment of crisis that taught him the most important thing to protect was not the brand, but the community built around it. The bell above the door chimed, a familiar sound but now ringing with new meaning. Mason, his son, walked in, still wearing his baseball uniform, sweat glistening on his brow. He dropped his glove on the counter and grinned. "Need me to help prep for tomorrow?" Julian looked at him and gently shook his head. "No, today I don't need your help. Today, I need you to learn." He pulled the old book from his coat pocket, opened it to the middle, where lines written in faded ink in ancient Greek filled the page. "This is the real recipe, not just for ingredients, but for holding on to what's right, even when everything around you wavers." Mason took the book, hesitant. "I can't read Greek." Julian smiled, wrapped an arm around his son's shoulder, and pointed to the flour and oven. "You don't have to. Just learn with your hands, your nose, your heart, the same way Grandpa taught me." The two stood together at the oven, the flames casting a soft glow across their faces, the warm scent of rising dough filling the air. Outside, the city roared and changed by the minute, but inside that kitchen, something ancient and precious was being preserved. Tomorrow, Julian knew, would bring new challenges. There would be demanding customers, media calls, delayed orders, and technical hiccups. But none of that frightened him anymore, because in the end, what he learned wasn't in any book. It was in the courage to rise at the right moment, to defend a pizza oven not for profit, but because it anchored the memory of an entire community. And somewhere, in the flickering firelight, he knew. His grandfather was smiling. Not long after Baker's Hearth made its powerful comeback, something unexpected began to happen. Thank you emails poured in, not just from local customers, but from small pizza shop owners in Texas, family bakers in Portland, and Italian noodle joints in Chicago. They all had one thing in common. Each had been manipulated, threatened, or forced to surrender under pressure from investment giants like Eastbrook. With her usual sharp insight, Clarissa quickly organized the messages and revealed a troubling picture. At least 7 other companies were silently using the same strategy, pushing restaurants into hardship, manipulating online reviews, forcing lowball sales, then replacing them with chain models. Julian, no longer alone with just his recipe book, now sat in an office that had transformed into a legal command center. A map of the United States covered the wall, dotted with red pins, each one a victim, a kitchen, a small shop that had once been the heartbeat of some neighborhood. "We can't just keep this fire for ourselves," he told Clarissa. "We have to pass it on." And so, the HearthShield Network was born. It wasn't just a legal aid fund anymore. HearthShield became a shared space for internal audit systems, fraud detection protocols, volunteer community attorney lists, digital complaint templates, and above all, a network built on trust. Julian hosted the first online seminar right in the main dining room of his shop, with a projector set between the brick oven and a rack of spices. Dozens of faces lit up the screen, old, young, of every background, but their eyes all held the same look, pain mixed with hope. "We've been tricked into thinking we're small," Julian began, "that we don't have the resources to stand up to the big corporations, that tradition must bow to cold profit. But today, I want to ask again, who cooked the first meals for the kids who just moved into the neighborhood? Who remembers which customers are allergic to cheese or gluten? Who waited for the retired lady every Thursday evening without ever needing a reminder?" Applause erupted from the screen. A cafe owner from New Jersey broke into tears. "They took my mother's shop, but because of you, I know I can start again," Clarissa whispered from the corner of the room, like a hidden ember in an old brick oven. "All it takes is one person to light it back up." Julian nodded. "We don't need to build a bonfire. We just need every place to keep its own light alive, and I promise one day that light will be strong enough to illuminate the entire industry." That night, after the shop had closed, Julian and Mason sat together in the kitchen, flowers still on their hands. Clarissa stepped in and handed them a freshly printed bulletin. The bold headline read, "Baker's Hearth launches federal campaign. FBI expands investigation." Julian gazed at the page in silence, then set it aside. "Tomorrow is a new day," he said, "and there are still many ovens we need to keep warm." That afternoon, Julian Baker stood by the front window of his restaurant as the setting sun cast long shadows across the red-tiled floor, the same hue of clay from the village where his grandfather was born on the outskirts of Athens. In his hands was the familiar leather-bound recipe book, now encased in a thin, protective glass cover with finely crafted copper edges. Beside him, Clarissa folded the morning paper. Baker's Hearth expands legal network. 3 major food conglomerates under joint investigation. He nodded, not smiling, but with a calm glow in his eyes. Outside, the shop remained busy, yet peaceful. The scent of freshly baked pizza lingered in the air just like it did on the very first day. But this time, something was more palpable. The atmosphere of a community now protected. No more suspicion, no more disruption, no more wary glances. Only trust and pizza. Julian walked into the kitchen, where Mason, now fluid in his dough handling, no longer clumsy like on his first day, was placing a tray into the oven. Clarissa stood beside him, gently guiding. "You're learning faster than I did," Julian teased. Mason looked up with a wide grin. "That's because you teach with both your hands and your heart." Julian placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then turned to Clarissa. "Do you think it's time?" She nodded. "He's ready." Julian removed the apron he had worn every morning for over 30 years, folded it neatly, and handed it to Mason. "This isn't just fabric, it's a shield. From now on, you wear it not to cook better food, but to cook food that's right." Mason accepted it with a bright look in his eyes, not because of any title, but because of what it meant. Clarissa placed a new picture frame on the counter. One photo of 3 generations of the Baker family. Julian's grandfather, his father, and Julian himself standing in front of the restaurant on opening day. Next to it was a photo taken that very morning. Julian, Clarissa, Mason, and the entire new staff, all standing under a banner that read, "We keep the fire alive." At that moment, the doorbell chimed. A little girl entered, holding her grandfather's hand. "Grandpa, I want the pizza with all the cheese, like last time." Julian laughed. "She looks familiar," Clarissa whispered. "Esperanza's granddaughter, 4th generation." Julian turned to Mason. "Go ahead and make it. Use the real recipe and the real heart." As the final pie of the day came out of the oven, Julian watched the cheese melt and stretch, the crust golden and even like a June afternoon. And for the first time, he felt something unexpected, light. He no longer worried about the restaurant's future, because that future stood right in front of him, with skills still forming, a heart already clear, and a legacy passed on fully and intact. Then, as if to close a perfect circle, Mason turned and asked, "Dad, what did great-grandpa say when he first taught you how to bake?" Julian paused for a moment, then answered, his gaze drifting through the window pane. He said, "Pizza isn't meant to fill your belly. It's meant to remind you that some things are worth keeping, no matter how much the world outside changes." Outside, the city lights began to flicker on. But inside Baker's hearth, the fire, both literal and symbolic, kept burning, steady and bright, never to be extinguished. In the ever-shifting world of business, what keeps a brand alive is not just a recipe, but the spirit of never giving in, even when betrayal comes from within. Julian didn't choose to retaliate with power, but with the very core values he stood for: kindness, loyalty, and faith in his community. If you believe that legacy cannot be bought but must be protected through action and courage, then like this video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories, and don't forget to leave a comment with the phrase "keep the fire" to help spread that spirit.